In the autumn of 1889, on a cold January morning in the city of Turin, a 44-year-old man who had spent the past decade writing some of the most radical philosophy in European history walked out of his rented room and into the Piazza Carlo Alberto. He was thin, nearly blind in one eye, racked by headaches that had tormented him for years, and utterly alone. He had no wife, no children, no academic position, almost no readers, and barely enough money to survive. His books had sold so poorly that he had been forced to pay for their publication himself. The greatest philosophers of his age had ignored him. The few who had read his work thought he was either mad or dangerous or both. And then he saw a coachman beating a horse. What happened next would become one of the most haunting images in the history of philosophy. According to the accounts that have come down to us, Friedrich Nietzsche ran across the cobblestones, threw his arms around the horse's neck to protect it from the blows, and collapsed weeping into the snow. He was helped back to his lodgings by passers-by. Over the following days he began writing strange letters to friends and to the crowned heads of Europe, letters full of grandiose proclamations, signing them sometimes as Dionysus and sometimes as the Crucified. When his old friend Franz Overbeck rushed to Turin and found him, Nietzsche was no longer recognisable as the man he'd known. Something had broken within him, something that would never be repaired. He would never write another word of philosophy. He would spend the next 11 years in the care of his mother and then his sister, sometimes silent for days, sometimes playing fragments of music on the piano with the remnants of his old genius, sometimes laughing or weeping without any apparent cause. He died in August of 1900, at the age of 55, and was buried in the village churchyard where his father, a Lutheran pastor, had once preached. And yet this man, this lonely wanderer who died in obscurity and madness, would become one of the most influential thinkers in the entire Western tradition. His ideas would shake the foundations of European philosophy. His famous declaration that God is dead would echo through the next century and a half of intellectual history. His concepts would shape existentialism, psychoanalysis, postmodernism, theology, literature, and the arts. His questions about meaning, value, suffering, and the affirmation of life would remain central to the way we think about what it means to be human. How does a pastor's son from a small village in eastern Germany become a man who stares so deeply into the abyss of meaning that it breaks him? What did he see there that no one else had been willing to look at? And why, more than a century after his death, do we keep returning to his words, keep wrestling with his challenges, keep feeling the unsettling pull of his vision? These are the questions we're going to follow, slowly, carefully, from the beginning to the end. This is a long story, and it moves through shadows as often as through light. So settle in, close your eyes if you like. We have all the time in the world. To understand Friedrich Nietzsche, you have to begin not with his ideas, but with the world he was born into, and with the losses that marked him before he was old enough to understand what loss meant. He came into the world on the 15th of October 1844 in a small village called Röcken, in the rural province of Saxony in eastern Germany. Röcken was the kind of place that barely appeared on maps, a cluster of houses and farms gathered around a Lutheran church surrounded by fields that stretched flat and quiet toward the horizon. The sky in that part of Germany is often grey, the winters long, the landscape unremarkable. It was not a place that seemed destined to produce anything that would shake the foundations of European thought. His father was Karl Ludwig Nietzsche, the village pastor, a gentle and scholarly man who had received his position through the patronage of the Prussian royal family. Karl Ludwig was by all accounts a man of deep piety and refined sensibility, devoted to music and to the life of the mind within the narrow confines permitted by his calling. When his son was born on the birthday of King Friedrich Wilhelm IV of Prussia, he named the child Friedrich Wilhelm in honour of the king, grateful for the royal favour that had given him his living. The pastor's wife, Franziska, was younger than her husband, the daughter of another Lutheran minister, raised in the same atmosphere of provincial Protestant piety that defined their world. She would outlive her son by nearly a decade, and her relationship with him would be complicated throughout his life, a mixture of love, incomprehension, and the particular kind of devotion that cannot quite reach across the gulf between an ordinary soul and an extraordinary one. For the first 4 years of his life, Friedrich lived in the world of the parsonage, surrounded by the rhythms of village religion, the tolling of church bells, the cycle of Sundays and feast days, the smell of incense and old wood, and the particular mustiness of books that have been read and handled by generations of ministers. He had a younger brother, named Ludwig Joseph, born 2 years after him, and a sister, Elizabeth, who would survive him and shape his legacy in ways he could never have imagined or wanted. And then, when Friedrich was 4 years old, the first shadow fell. His father began to suffer from what the doctors of the time called a softening of the brain. The precise diagnosis is lost to history, but it may have been a brain tumour, or a series of strokes, or some hereditary neurological condition that would haunt the family line. Carl Ludwig deteriorated over the course of a year, losing his faculties gradually, suffering terrible headaches, becoming confused and then incapacitated. The little boy watched his father transform from a gentle scholar into a failing body, a presence that groaned in darkened rooms, a source of fear and confusion rather than comfort. In July of 1849, Carl Ludwig Nietzsche died. He was 35 years old. His son was not yet 5. Try to imagine what this meant for a child of that age. The centre of his world, the man who represented both earthly authority and divine order, the embodiment of everything stable and meaningful, was suddenly gone. And not merely gone, but taken away by a process of slow decay that the boy could not understand. A process that seemed to suggest that even the strongest and most beloved figures could be unmade from within, consumed by some invisible force that no prayer could stop. 6 months later, his younger brother Ludwig Joseph died as well. The boy was only 2 years old. The cause is not recorded in the family documents that survive. He was there, and then he was not there, and the household of women, the mother, the grandmother, the aunts, drew closer around the surviving children in their grief. Friedrich would later write that he had dreamed of his brother's death before it happened, that he had heard funeral music in his sleep and seen a grave opening to receive a small coffin. Whether this memory was accurate or whether it was shaped by later knowledge, it speaks to something real about the atmosphere of his early childhood. Death was not an abstraction for this boy. It was a presence in the house, a visitor who had come twice before he was 5 years old and who might return at any moment. The world was not safe. The people you loved could be taken from you by forces you could not see or control. And the faith that was supposed to make sense of these things, the Lutheran Christianity that surrounded him on every side, offered consolation but not understanding. After his father's death, the family moved to the nearby town of Naumburg, leaving the village parsonage behind. Naumburg was larger, more prosperous, a market town with medieval churches and cobblestone streets, and a population of several thousand. The household now consisted of Friedrich, his sister Elizabeth, his mother Franziska, his grandmother Erdmutter, and 2 maiden aunts. There was no male presence in the home. The boy grew up surrounded entirely by women, in an atmosphere of Protestant piety and bourgeois respectability, under the watchful eyes of relatives who saw in him the hopes that had been buried with his father. He was a strange child, even by the standards of a strange childhood. He was intensely sensitive, prone to fits of emotion, serious beyond his years. He had his father's love of music and showed an early gift for it, playing the piano with surprising skill and composing small pieces before he was 10 years old. He was also ferociously intelligent, devouring books, learning languages, questioning everything with a persistence that made the adults around him both proud and uneasy. And he was devout. In those early years, he embraced the faith of his family with an intensity that surprised even his pious relatives. He read the Bible with passionate attention. He prayed with fervour. He spoke of religious matters with such gravity and such precocious wisdom that his schoolmates gave him a nickname that would follow him for years, the Little Pastor. It is worth pausing over this detail, because it tells us something essential about the man Nietzsche would become, the philosopher who would declare that God is dead, who would attack Christianity with a ferocity unmatched in modern thought, who would call himself the Antichrist, began as a child consumed by religious devotion. The violence of his later attacks on faith was not the violence of someone who had never believed. It was the violence of someone who had believed deeply, who had needed the consolation of faith as only a grieving child can need it, and who had felt that consolation crumble beneath him over the course of years. His childhood faith was not merely inherited. It was a response to loss, a way of making sense of the deaths that had shattered his early world. If his father was gone, then perhaps his father was with God. If his brother was gone, then perhaps his brother was in heaven. If the world was full of suffering, then perhaps that suffering had meaning. was part of a plan, would be redeemed in some life beyond this one. The little pastor was not playing at religion. He was holding on to it the way a drowning child holds onto a rope, but the rope was not as strong as it seemed. At the age of 14, Friedrich Nietzsche's life changed in a way that would set the course of everything that followed. He was awarded a scholarship to Schulpforta, one of the most prestigious boarding schools in Germany, a place that had been producing scholars and statesmen for 3 centuries. Schulpforta was not an ordinary school. It was housed in a former Cistercian monastery about 4 kilometres from Naumburg, a complex of ancient buildings set among gardens and orchards, with high stone walls and an atmosphere that seemed to belong to an earlier age. The discipline was severe. Students rose before dawn, attended chapel, spent their days in rigorous study of Latin, Greek, Hebrew, mathematics, and the classical authors. The education was designed to produce men of learning and moral seriousness, scholars who could read Plato in the original and debate the finer points of Cicero's rhetoric. For a boy like Friedrich, it was both a paradise and a trial. The intellectual stimulation was exactly what he craved. He threw himself into his studies with an intensity that impressed even the demanding masters of Schulpforta. He excelled in languages especially, developing a command of Greek and Latin that would later make him one of the finest classical philologists of his generation. He continued to compose music, writing complex pieces that showed genuine talent. He formed friendships with other gifted students, young men who shared his passion for ideas and for the life of the mind. But the discipline was hard on him. He was not physically robust. He suffered from headaches even then, the first signs of the neurological troubles that would torment him throughout his life. The long hours of study, the early mornings, the regimented schedule, all of this took a toll on his health. And there was something else, something harder to name. The atmosphere of Schulpforta was still deeply religious, still shaped by the Protestant piety that had founded it centuries ago. Chapel attendance was mandatory. The moral framework was Christian through and through, and yet even as he excelled at his studies, even as he impressed his teachers with his brilliance, something was beginning to shift within him. He was reading more widely now, encountering ideas that did not fit neatly within the framework he had inherited. He was asking questions that his faith could not easily answer. He was beginning to feel the first stirrings of the doubt that would eventually consume everything he had once believed. It was not a dramatic break, not at first. It was more like a slow erosion, the way water wears away stone over years and centuries. The questions accumulated. The answers seemed less and less satisfying. The little pastor was growing into something else, something he did not yet have a name for. He graduated from Schulpforta in 1864 at the age of 19, with a reputation as one of the most brilliant students the school had ever produced. He had won prizes for his essays, mastered multiple languages, composed music that was performed at school ceremonies. His teachers expected great things from him. The path ahead seemed clear. He would go to university, study theology or classical philology, take up a respectable career as a scholar or perhaps as a pastor like his father. But Friedrich Nietzsche was no longer the little pastor. Something had happened to him during those years at Schulpforta, something that he himself may not have fully understood. The faith that had sustained his childhood was no longer there. He had looked at it closely, examined it with the same rigour he brought to his Greek texts, and found it wanting. He did not announce this to his family, who would have been devastated. He did not make a public break with the church, but inwardly, quietly, he had already begun the journey that would lead him to declare, 2 decades later, that God was dead. In the autumn of 1864, Friedrich Nietzsche enrolled at the University of Bonn, ostensibly to study theology in preparation for a career in the church. His mother believed he would follow in his father's footsteps. His relatives expected him to become a pastor. For a semester or 2 he went through the motions, attending lectures on theology, participating in the rituals of university life. But Bonn was a revelation of a different kind. For the first time in his life, Nietzsche was free from the watchful eyes of his family, free from the strict discipline of Schulpforta, free to make his own choices about how to spend his time and what to think about. And what he discovered was that he did not want to study theology at all. The questions that interested him were not the questions that theology was designed to answer. He wanted to understand the ancient world, to penetrate the mystery of Greek culture, to discover what had made the Greeks great and what their greatness might mean for the modern world. He also discovered something else at Bonn, something that shocked his pious relatives when they learned of it. He joined a student fraternity, one of the beer-drinking, sabre-fencing societies that were central to German university culture. He drank heavily for a time. He got into a duel and received a small wound on his nose that he carried for the rest of his life. He flirted with the kind of dissipation that was expected of young German students, and that was entirely foreign to the serious, devout boy his family thought they knew. This period of rebellion did not last long. Nietzsche was too serious a person, too driven by intellectual hunger to waste himself in drinking and dueling. But it marked a real break from his past, a moment when he stepped outside the framework that had been prepared for him and glimpsed a different kind of life. By the end of his first year at Bonn, he had made a decision that would define his future. He would abandon theology entirely and dedicate himself to classical philology, the rigorous scholarly study of ancient Greek and Roman texts. He transferred to the University of Leipzig in the autumn of 1865, seeking out Friedrich Nietzsche, the greatest philologist in Germany, a master of the discipline who would recognise Nietzsche's extraordinary gifts and launch him on his meteoric academic career. At Leipzig, the young student found his calling. He threw himself into his studies with an intensity that astonished his teachers and his fellow students. He learned not merely to read the ancient texts, but to analyse them with a precision that bordered on obsession, to trace the history of individual words through centuries of usage, to reconstruct the lost manuscripts behind the corrupt copies that had survived. Ritschl saw immediately that he was dealing with something exceptional. He had taught many brilliant students over the years, but he had never encountered anyone quite like Friedrich Nietzsche. The young man's combination of linguistic brilliance, philosophical depth, and passionate engagement with the material was unlike anything Ritschl had seen. He began to promote his student, to introduce him to the scholarly world, to prepare the way for a career that seemed destined for greatness. But something else happened at Leipzig, something that would prove more important than any academic advancement. Nietzsche discovered the philosophy of Arthur Schopenhauer. It happened almost by accident. One day in 1865, Nietzsche wandered into a used bookshop in Leipzig and picked up a copy of Schopenhauer's major work, The World as Will and Representation. He bought it on impulse, took it back to his lodgings, and began to read. What he encountered there would change the course of his life. Schopenhauer's philosophy was a dark vision of existence, perhaps the darkest that any major European philosopher had ever articulated. According to Schopenhauer, the fundamental reality underlying all appearances was something he called the will, a blind, purposeless, insatiable striving that drove all living things to struggle, to suffer, and to die. Life was not meaningful in any ultimate sense. There was no God watching over the world, no divine plan being worked out through history, no redemption waiting at the end of time. There was only the endless, futile striving of the will and the suffering that came with it. For Nietzsche, reading Schopenhauer was like having a veil torn away from his eyes. Here was a philosopher who saw the world as it really was, without the comfortable illusions of religion or the easy optimism of conventional philosophy. Here was a mind brave enough to stare into the darkness and describe what it saw there. The young student was electrified. He felt that Schopenhauer was speaking directly to him, articulating truth that he had sensed but had never been able to express. He spent 2 weeks reading and rereading The World as Will and Representation, barely sleeping, barely eating, consumed by the dark beauty of Schopenhauer's vision. When he emerged from this period of intense engagement, he was no longer the same person. His childhood faith, already weakened, was now entirely gone. In its place was something new, a philosophical seriousness that would drive him for the rest of his life. Nietzsche would eventually move beyond Schopenhauer, rejecting the older philosopher's pessimism and his prescription of resignation as the only response to suffering. But the impact of that first encounter was indelible. Schopenhauer had shown him that philosophy could be a matter of life and death, that ideas could shake you to your foundations, that thinking was not merely an academic exercise, but a way of confronting the deepest questions of existence. And he had shown him something else, something that would take longer to work out, that the death of God was not merely a loss, but an opportunity. If the old foundations were gone, then new ones would have to be built. If the old values no longer held, then new values would have to be created. Nietzsche did not see this clearly yet, not in 1865, but the seed had been planted. While Nietzsche was absorbing the shock of Schopenhauer and mastering the intricacies of Greek philology, another figure was rising in the cultural world of German-speaking Europe, a figure who would become the second great influence on the young philosopher's development and the second great disillusionment of his intellectual life. Richard Wagner was already famous when Nietzsche first encountered his music. He was the most revolutionary composer of the age, a man who had set out to transform not merely opera, but the entire nature of art, to create what he called the Gesamtkunstwerk, the total work of art, in which music, poetry, drama, and visual spectacle would fuse into a single overwhelming experience. His operas were unlike anything that had come before, vast, complex, emotionally overwhelming, built on a revolutionary harmonic language that pushed the boundaries of what music could express. Nietzsche first heard Wagner's music in Leipzig, probably the prelude to Tristan and Isolde, that famous piece that seems to yearn towards some resolution it never quite achieves, that captures in sound the endless striving and unfulfillment that Schopenhauer had described as the essence of existence. The young student was overwhelmed. Here was an artist who seemed to have understood Schopenhauer, who had translated that dark philosophy into sound, who had created beauty out of the recognition that all striving is futile and all desire is doomed. In November of 1868, Nietzsche met Wagner in person. The meeting was arranged by a mutual acquaintance, and it took place at the home of Wagner's sister in Leipzig. Nietzsche was 24 years old, a brilliant student on the verge of an unprecedented academic appointment. Wagner was 55, famous throughout Europe, surrounded by controversy, and living in a complicated domestic situation with Cosima von Bülow, the wife of his conductor and the daughter of Franz Liszt, who would eventually become Wagner's own wife after a scandal that rocked German society. The meeting was a success beyond anything Nietzsche could have hoped. Wagner was charmed by the brilliant young philologist who knew so much about Greek tragedy, and who seemed to understand his music better than almost anyone else. Nietzsche was overwhelmed by the force of Wagner's personality, by his volcanic energy, by his grandiose vision of what art could be and what it could accomplish. A friendship began that night, a friendship that would define the next decade of Nietzsche's life, and that would end in one of the most painful ruptures in intellectual history. But all of that was in the future. In the early months of 1869, Nietzsche's life took a turn that seemed to confirm everything his teachers and admirers had expected of him. He was appointed to the chair of classical philology at the University of Basel in Switzerland. He was 24 years old. He had not yet completed his doctoral dissertation. The appointment was so unusual, so contrary to all academic precedent, that the University of Leipzig awarded him his doctorate without requiring him to defend a thesis, simply on the basis of his published work. It was a triumph, the beginning of what should have been a distinguished and conventional academic career. But Friedrich Nietzsche was not destined for a conventional life. The young professor who arrived in Basel in the spring of 1869 carried within him contradictions that would eventually tear him apart. The devotion of the little pastor and the atheism of Schopenhauer's disciple, the rigour of the classical scholar and the revolutionary vision of Wagner's follower, the longing for friendship and the terrible solitude that would mark his final years. He did not know any of this yet. He knew only that he was young, brilliant, and at the beginning of something new. The shadow of his father's death, the memory of the softening brain, the fear of what might be waiting in his own future, all of this he pushed aside. There was work to do, ideas to develop, a new kind of philosophy to create. The abyss was still far away, or so it seemed. The first great book was already taking shape in his mind, the book that would end his career as a respectable philologist and begin his life as one of the most disturbing thinkers in the Western tradition. He would call it The Birth of Tragedy, and it would attempt to answer a question that had haunted him since his first encounters with the ancient world. What had made the Greeks great, and what had caused that greatness to die? The answer he would find there would lead him eventually to the death of God, to the will to power, to the eternal recurrence, to the figure of the Übermensch, and finally to that cold morning in Turin when he would throw his arms around a beaten horse and lose his mind forever. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. The story unfolds slowly, layer by layer, tragedy by tragedy. And there is time, here in the quiet, to follow it all the way down. The Birth of Tragedy appeared in January of 1872. And to understand why it mattered, why it destroyed Nietzsche's career as a classical scholar and launched his life as a philosopher, we have to understand what he was trying to do with it and what he was trying to overturn. The received wisdom among German classicists in the 19th century, the view that had dominated since the work of Johann Joachim Winckelmann a century earlier, held that ancient Greece represented a kind of golden age of serene beauty, noble simplicity, and quiet grandeur. The Greeks in this telling were a people of perfect balance, of harmonious forms, of sunlit temples and marble statues whose calm gazes embodied an ideal of measured restraint. This was the Greece of the Apollonian principle, though no one called it that yet, the Greece of reason and order, and the perfection of visible form. Nietzsche looked at this picture and saw that it was false, not entirely false, but catastrophically incomplete, because the Germans of his time had forgotten, or had chosen not to see, that the same culture that produced the serene temples and the perfect proportions of classical sculpture had also produced something else entirely. It had produced the Dionysian festivals, the ecstatic rites, the Maenads tearing animals apart with their bare hands, the chorus of masked singers dancing in honour of a god who represented not order, but dissolution, not individuation, but the annihilation of the individual, not the calm daylight of reason, but the intoxicated darkness of instinct and unity with the primal forces of existence. The Apollonian and the Dionysian. Two principles, two gods, two opposing forces within the Greek soul. Apollo, god of light, of prophecy, of the visual arts, of the principium individuationis, the principle by which we become separate selves with clear boundaries and distinct identities, and Dionysus, god of wine, of theatre, of music, of the dissolution of those boundaries, the god in whose worship the individual ego melted away into something larger, darker, more terrible, and more alive. Nietzsche's argument was that Greek tragedy, the supreme achievement of Athenian culture, had arisen from the creative tension between these two forces. The tragic chorus, with its music and its dancing and its collective voice, represented the Dionysian element. The individual actors, wearing their masks, speaking their lines, representing distinct characters with names and histories and fates, represented the Apollonian element. And in the great tragedies of Aeschylus and Sophocles, these two principles had achieved a miraculous balance, a fusion that allowed the Greeks to stare directly into the horror and meaninglessness of existence without being destroyed by it. Because this was the crucial point, the insight that would echo through everything Nietzsche would write for the rest of his life. The Greeks knew. They knew that life was suffering, that existence was painful, that beneath the beautiful surface of things there was chaos and darkness and death. They knew the wisdom of Silenus, the companion of Dionysus, who, when captured by King Midas and asked what was the best thing for human beings, had laughed and answered that the best thing was not to have been born at all, and the second best was to die quickly. The Greeks had looked into the abyss. They had seen the Dionysian truth, that we are not really separate selves at all, that individuation is a kind of illusion, that beneath the surface we are all part of the same primal unity, endlessly creating and destroying itself. And knowing this, they had not despaired. They had not turned away. They had created art. They had created tragedy. They had found a way to transform the unbearable into the beautiful, to affirm life precisely in its most terrible aspects. This was the birth of tragedy, this fusion of Apollonian form and Dionysian wisdom, this act of creative redemption through art. But then, Nietzsche argued, something went wrong. A new figure appeared on the Athenian scene, a figure who would bring this great synthesis to an end. His name was Socrates, and with Socrates came a new principle, different from both the Apollonian and the Dionysian, a principle Nietzsche called theoretical optimism, the belief that reason could comprehend existence, that knowledge could solve the problem of life, that if we only thought clearly enough, we could make sense of everything and thereby overcome the tragic condition. Socrates, in Nietzsche's telling, was the great enemy of tragedy, not because he was a bad man, but because he represented a fundamental turning away from the tragic wisdom of the earlier Greeks. The Socratic equation, that reason equals virtue equals happiness, was a kind of denial, a refusal to accept that existence might be fundamentally irrational, that suffering might not be solvable, that the deepest truths might not be accessible to logical analysis. And Euripides, the third of the great tragedians, had fallen under Socratic influence. His plays introduced a new kind of realism, a psychological clarity, a rationalizing tendency that drained the Dionysian element from tragedy and left only the Apollonian shell. And so tragedy died. It was murdered, Nietzsche wrote, by Socratic optimism, by the belief that knowledge was the highest good, by the faith in reason that would eventually become the dominant mode of Western thinking. The great fusion was broken. The ability to stare into the abyss and create beauty from what one saw there was lost, and Western civilization had been living in the shadow of that loss ever since. This was explosive enough. But Nietzsche was not content merely to diagnose the past. He believed that in his own time, in 19th century Germany, there was a possibility of rebirth. And the vehicle of that rebirth, he argued, was the music of Richard Wagner. Wagner's operas, his total works of art, his fusion of music and poetry and drama and spectacle, represented for the young Nietzsche a return of the Dionysian spirit. The overwhelming power of Wagnerian music, its ability to dissolve the listener's sense of individual selfhood into a larger oceanic feeling, its darkness and its ecstasy and its willingness to confront the most disturbing aspects of human existence, all of this seemed to Nietzsche like the second coming of tragic art. Wagner was not merely a composer, he was a cultural revolutionary. He was going to redeem modernity from the shallow optimism of Socratic culture and restore the tragic wisdom that had made the Greeks great. The Birth of Tragedy was dedicated to Richard Wagner. It ended with a hymn of praise to his music, and it was received by the academic establishment with something approaching horror. The book violated every principle of respectable classical scholarship. It made wild speculative claims that could not be verified by the careful study of texts. It mixed philology with metaphysics, historical analysis with cultural prophecy, scholarly argument with what could only be called artistic vision. Ulrich von Wilamowitz-Müllendorf, a young philologist who would go on to become one of the most distinguished classicists of his generation, published a devastating review that accused Nietzsche of ignorance, of willful distortion, of abandoning everything that made classical scholarship a science. Other reviews were equally harsh. Within the academic world, Nietzsche's reputation was destroyed almost overnight. His courses at Basel, which had been well attended before the book's publication, suddenly found themselves nearly empty. Students were warned away from him by their other professors. He was no longer a rising star. He was a cautionary tale, an example of what happened when a brilliant young scholar let his imagination run away with his judgment. Nietzsche was wounded by this reception. He had believed that his book would be recognized as a work of genius, that it would inaugurate a new era in the understanding of Greek culture and in the cultural life of Germany itself. Instead, it had made him a pariah in his own profession. He continued to teach, but his heart was no longer in philology. Something had shifted. The book had failed in the academic world, but in writing it, Nietzsche had discovered that he was not really a philologist at all. He was something else. He was a philosopher, though he did not yet know what kind of philosopher he would become. The years that followed the publication of The Birth of Tragedy were years of transition and transformation. Nietzsche continued to lecture, continued to publish occasional philological essays, continued to maintain the outward forms of his academic position. But his real intellectual life was happening elsewhere, in his friendships, in his reading, in the long walks he took through the Swiss countryside, in the conversations he had with himself in the solitude of his rented rooms. His friendship with Wagner deepened in these years, though it also became more complicated. Nietzsche was a frequent visitor at Tribschen, the villa on Lake Lucerne, where Wagner lived with Cosima and their children. He spent Christmas there. He helped with arrangements for the Bayreuth Festival, the great theatre Wagner was building in Bavaria to house productions of his operas. He ran errands, offered suggestions, basked in the warmth of the Wagner's attention and approval. But even as he drew closer to Wagner, seeds of doubt were taking root. Nietzsche was sensitive, almost painfully sensitive, to matters of taste and tone, and there were things about Wagner that troubled him. The composer's vanity, his endless need for admiration and agreement, his casual cruelty to those who displeased him, his growing interest in Christianity, which seemed to Nietzsche like a betrayal of the Dionysian spirit, and most troubling of all, the anti-Semitism that ran through Wagner's circle like a dark current, the casual jokes about Jews, the conspiracy theories, the blame assigned to Jewish influence for everything that was wrong with modern culture. Nietzsche's own views on these matters were complicated. He was a man of his time and place, and some of his early letters contain remarks that a modern reader finds disturbing. But he was never an anti-Semite in the virulent sense that his sister and her husband would be, and as he grew older, his opposition to anti-Semitism became more explicit and more fierce. He would eventually describe anti-Semites as one of the forms of mob resentment that he most despised, and Wagner's movement in that direction troubled him deeply, even if he did not yet say so openly. The break would come later, and we will come to it in time. For now, in the early 1870s, the friendship still held, though it was growing strained beneath the surface. Nietzsche was becoming his own thinker, developing ideas that would eventually diverge sharply from Wagner's worldview. He was reading new books, encountering new influences, thinking thoughts that could not be contained within the framework of the birth of tragedy. One book in particular mattered. It was a collection of essays by a French writer named Paul Bourget, but what it led Nietzsche to was far more significant. Through this and other reading, Nietzsche began to encounter the tradition of French moralism, the aphoristic writers like La Rochefoucauld, Pascal, Montaigne, who had spent centuries examining the darker motivations behind human behaviour. These writers had no illusions about human nature. They saw through the noble surfaces to the petty self-interest beneath. They understood that people lied to themselves, that virtuous behaviour was often motivated by vanity, that what we called conscience was frequently just fear of social disapproval dressed up in moral language. This psychological acuity, this willingness to look beneath the surface of human action and ask what was really driving it, would become one of the hallmarks of Nietzsche's mature philosophy. He was developing what he would later call the art of mistrust, the habit of asking, whenever confronted with a noble-seeming value or a sacred belief, what interest does this serve? Who benefits from this arrangement? What underlying power dynamic is being disguised as timeless truth? Meanwhile, his health was deteriorating. He had never been robust. Even as a schoolboy at Forta, he had suffered from headaches and digestive troubles. But in his late 20s and early 30s, these problems intensified dramatically. The headaches became migraines of blinding intensity, lasting sometimes for days, leaving him prostrate in darkened rooms, unable to read or write or do anything but endure the pain. His eyesight weakened. He could barely see to write, and had to dictate more and more of his work to friends and paid assistants. His stomach rebelled against almost everything he ate. Doctors examined him, prescribed various treatments, and accomplished nothing. The cause of his suffering remained mysterious. Some historians now suspect that he was already experiencing the early effects of whatever neurological condition would eventually destroy his mind. Others point to his strict vegetarian diets, his experiments with various drugs including chloral hydrate and opium, his chronic insomnia. Whatever the cause, he was in constant pain, and the pain shaped everything he thought and wrote. There is something almost heroic about the work he produced under these conditions, or perhaps heroic is the wrong word, something defiant, something that refused to submit to suffering even while being consumed by it. The books that would make him immortal were written by a man who often could not see the page, who had to stop every few sentences to close his aching eyes, who lived for days at a time on nothing but milk and rusks because his stomach could tolerate nothing else. And yet he continued. He thought and wrote and thought again, working through ideas that would change the landscape of Western philosophy. In 1878 he published Human, All Too Human, and everything changed. This was a different kind of book from The Birth of Tragedy. Gone was the sweeping cultural prophecy, the Wagnerian bombast, the grand metaphysical speculations about Apollonian and Dionysian principles. In its place was something cooler, more analytic, more suspicious. The book was written in aphorisms and short essays, fragments of thought that circled around questions of morality, religion, art, and human nature without ever settling into systematic doctrine. And it was dedicated not to Richard Wagner, but to the memory of Voltaire on the centenary of his death. The dedication was a declaration of war, and Wagner understood it as such. Voltaire represented everything Wagner despised: rationalism, scepticism, French clarity, hostility to German romanticism. By dedicating his new book to Voltaire, Nietzsche was announcing that he had moved beyond the Wagnerian orbit. He was no longer a disciple, he was thinking for himself. The book itself went further. It attacked metaphysics, it attacked religion, it attacked the very notion of higher truths accessible through art or intuition. It proposed instead a kind of philosophical naturalism, an attempt to understand human behaviour and belief as natural phenomena, products of history and psychology and biology, rather than as revelations of eternal truth. It looked at morality and saw not divine commandments, but human constructions, useful fictions that served particular purposes and could be analysed like any other human artefact. Wagner read the book and was devastated. He wrote to friends that Nietzsche had been corrupted by Jewish influences, that he had betrayed everything he once believed, that the brilliant young man who had understood the mission of German art had become an enemy of everything sacred. The friendship was over. They would never meet again. For Nietzsche, the break was painful but also liberating. He was free now, free from Wagner's overwhelming personality, free from the obligation to believe in anyone's system but his own. He was alone, and the loneliness was terrible, but it was also the condition of his greatest work. In the years that followed, living in cheap boarding houses in the Alps and on the Mediterranean coast, eating his inadequate meals, walking for hours through landscapes of astonishing beauty, while his head pounded and his eyes burned, he would write the books that made him immortal. And the first question he would ask, the question that would drive everything else, was the question of morality itself. Where do our moral values come from? Why do we believe that some things are good and others evil? Are these distinctions written into the fabric of the universe, or are they human inventions, tools we have made for purposes we have forgotten? These questions had never been asked quite this way before, and the answers Nietzsche would propose would disturb the sleep of Western civilization for generations to come. The question haunted him through his lonely winters on the Italian coast, through his summers in the thin, clear air of the Swiss mountains, through the endless hours of walking and thinking and writing in his cold rented rooms. Where do our moral values come from? It sounds like a simple question. It is not. For thousands of years the answer had seemed obvious to anyone raised in the Christian tradition. Our moral values come from God. They are written into the structure of reality itself. Good is good because God commands it, and evil is evil because God forbids it. The 10 Commandments were carved in stone on Mount Sinai, handed down from the heavens, and they apply to all people in all places for all time. To question them would be not merely wrong but absurd, like questioning whether 2 and 2 make 4. This was the foundation upon which European civilization had built itself. And Nietzsche believed that this foundation had quietly crumbled, that the God who had guaranteed these values had died in the hearts of modern Europeans without their quite realizing it, and that the consequences of this death had not yet begun to be felt. God is dead, he wrote. We have killed him, you and I. All of us are his murderers. This is perhaps Nietzsche's most famous line, and it is also his most misunderstood. He was not making a metaphysical claim. He was not arguing as an atheist might argue that there is no supreme being in the heavens. He was making a cultural diagnosis. He was describing something that had already happened in the minds of educated Europeans, whether they admitted it or not. The old certainties had dissolved. The faith that had organised and sustained Western civilization for 1,000 years had lost its grip on the modern imagination, and yet everyone went on living as though nothing had changed. They still spoke of good and evil. They still believed in right and wrong. They still held to the values that Christianity had taught them, the value of humility, of compassion, of equality before God. But they no longer believed in the God who was supposed to guarantee those values. They had kept the morality and discarded its foundation. And Nietzsche wanted to know what would happen when people finally noticed, when they finally understood that they were standing on nothing, that the ground beneath their feet had vanished, and they were suspended over an abyss. This was the problem he set himself to solve in the decade of his great works. Not whether God existed, which he considered a settled question for anyone who thought clearly, but what would replace God? What would give meaning and value to human life in an age when the old answers no longer worked? And to solve this problem, he had to understand where the old answers had come from in the first place. He had to trace the genealogy of morals. This is what he set out to do in some of his most provocative and disturbing work. He wanted to understand morality not as a philosopher usually does, by asking what we ought to do, but as a historian and a psychologist, by asking how our current notions of good and evil came to be. He wanted to tell the story of morality, to uncover its origins, to expose the human interests and drives that had shaped it. And the story he told was unlike anything that had been told before. Imagine, he said, the ancient world before Christianity. Imagine the warrior aristocracies of Greece and Rome, the noble classes who ruled by strength and courage and the will to dominate. These people had a morality, but it was very different from what we call morality today. They distinguished between good and bad, but by good they meant something like noble, powerful, beautiful, excellent, and by bad they meant something like common, weak, ugly, contemptible. This was a morality of self-affirmation. The noble man said yes to himself. He was proud of his strength. He gloried in his superiority. He did not need anyone's permission to be great. He simply was great, and he knew it, and his morality was an expression of that greatness. This was what Nietzsche called master morality. It was the morality of the strong, the healthy, the self-confident, and it prevailed in the ancient world for centuries. But then something happened. Something changed. A new morality arose, a morality that inverted all the old values, that called strength evil and weakness good, that praised humility instead of pride, suffering instead of joy, meekness instead of mastery. This was slave morality, and Nietzsche traced its origins to a single source: the slaves themselves, the weak, the oppressed, the people who could not fight back against their masters and so had to find another way to resist. Think about what it would be like, he said, to be weak in a world ruled by the strong. Think about what it would be like to be a slave in ancient Rome, to be humiliated and beaten, to watch your masters enjoy their pleasures while you laboured in chains. You could not overthrow them. You could not defeat them in battle. You could not even hope to become like them. What could you do? You could change the meaning of the words. You could take the very things that made your masters powerful and declare them to be evil. You could take the very things that made you weak and declare them to be good. Strength becomes aggression, cruelty, sin. Weakness becomes humility, patience, virtue. Pride becomes vanity, ambition becomes wickedness, and the meek, the poor, the suffering, they become the blessed ones, the inheritors of the earth, the beloved of God. This was what Nietzsche called the slave revolt in morality, and he believed that it had achieved its greatest triumph in Christianity. The early Christians were not philosophers in the Greek sense. They were the poor, the marginalized, the oppressed peoples of the Roman Empire who found in the teachings of Jesus a way to make sense of their suffering and to feel morally superior to their oppressors. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. These words, spoken by a Jewish teacher in Roman Palestine, offered something unprecedented in the ancient world. They offered the powerless a kind of power, the power to judge their masters, to declare them wicked, to believe that they would be punished in the afterlife while the humble and the suffering would be rewarded. Nietzsche did not admire this. He called it resentment, using the French word ressentiment to capture a particular psychological state, the state of impotent hatred that cannot express itself directly, and so turns inward, festering, plotting, redefining the world so that one's own weakness becomes virtue and the strength of others becomes sin. Slave morality, he argued, was born from this resentment. It was a moral system created by people who could not compete with the strong on the strong's terms, and who therefore had to change the terms of competition. And it had won. It had conquered the Roman Empire. It had shaped Western civilization. It had become so deeply embedded in the European mind that even after God had died, people continued to think in its categories. They still believed that humility was better than pride. They still believed that the strong should restrain themselves for the sake of the weak. They still believed in equality, in compassion, in self-denial. These were Christian values, Nietzsche said, values that made sense only if there was a God who rewarded the humble and punished the proud. But there was no such God, and so these values were suspended over nothing, ghosts of a faith that no longer existed, and the people who held them did not understand what they were doing or why. This analysis was and remains profoundly disturbing. It disturbed Nietzsche's contemporaries, and it continues to disturb us today, not because we can easily dismiss it, but because there is a kernel of uncomfortable truth in it that is very hard to face. Did Christianity arise among the powerless? It did. Did it offer consolation to the suffering and judgment upon the strong? It did. Did it overturn the values of the ancient aristocracies and replace them with something radically different? It did. Whether this transformation was a great moral advance, as most people in the Christian tradition have believed, or a great moral disaster, as Nietzsche believed, depends on what you think human life is for. And that is precisely the question Nietzsche wanted us to ask. He was not, as his critics often claimed, simply advocating a return to ancient brutality. He was not saying that we should all become Roman gladiators or Homeric warriors. He was too subtle a thinker for that. What he was saying was that we needed to understand the origins of our values, to see them clearly, to recognize that they were not inevitable, not natural, not given by the universe, but made by particular people, for particular purposes, at particular moments in history. And once we understood this, once we saw through the illusion that our morality was eternal and absolute, we could begin to ask the more terrifying question: what values should we create? What should we affirm? What would it mean to say yes to life in all its complexity and cruelty and beauty, without the comforting fiction of a God who would make everything right in the end? This was where Nietzsche's thought became truly radical. Most philosophers before him had tried to provide new foundations for morality after the death of God. They had sought to ground ethics in reason, in utility, in the social contract, in the categorical imperative. Nietzsche distrusted all such projects. He did not believe that morality could be put on a rational foundation. He did not believe that it should be. Morality for him was not a matter of truth at all. It was a matter of creation. The question was not which morality is true, but which morality makes human beings stronger, more vital, more capable of affirming their existence. And to answer that question, one had to understand what life itself was for. This was where his idea of the will to power became central. Nietzsche rejected the notion, common in his time, that the fundamental drive of living things was self-preservation. He also rejected the utilitarian idea that all creatures seek pleasure and avoid pain. These theories, he thought, described only the surface of life. They missed its deeper movement, its essential dynamism. Life, for Nietzsche, was not a matter of merely staying alive or of accumulating pleasant sensations. Life was a matter of growth, expansion, overcoming, mastery. Every living thing, from the simplest organism to the most complex human culture, was driven by what he called the will to power, the drive to increase its strength, to extend its reach, to impose its form on the world around it. This does not mean mere political or military power, though it can include those. It means something more fundamental. The will to power is the drive of the artist to create, of the thinker to understand, of the scientist to discover, of the body to strengthen itself, of the culture to shape the minds of its members. It is the energy of life itself, always pushing, always striving, always seeking to become more than it was. And Nietzsche believed that any morality which denied or suppressed this will to power was a morality of decline, a morality that weakened life instead of strengthening it. This was his deepest criticism of Christianity. Not that it was false, though he believed it was false, but that it was hostile to life. It taught people to deny their natural drives, to feel ashamed of their bodies, to cultivate weakness instead of strength, to look away from this world toward another world that did not exist. It poisoned the will to power at its source. What then was the alternative? What would a life-affirming morality look like? This was the question that drove Nietzsche's most famous and most enigmatic work, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Written between 1883 and 1885, during some of the loneliest and most painful years of his life, the book took the form of a kind of philosophical novel, a collection of speeches and parables attributed to a fictional prophet named Zarathustra, who had gone into the mountains to meditate and who returned after many years to teach humanity a new message. Zarathustra was loosely based on Zoroaster, the ancient Persian prophet who had founded one of the world's first monotheistic religions. But Nietzsche's Zarathustra was not bringing a religion. He was bringing an anti-religion, or perhaps something beyond religion altogether. His message was the opposite of what the historical Zoroaster had taught. Where Zoroaster had proclaimed the existence of a good God and an evil spirit locked in cosmic struggle, Nietzsche's Zarathustra proclaimed that God was dead and that humanity must create its own meaning. Where Zoroaster had taught the importance of choosing good over evil, Zarathustra taught that good and evil were human inventions, and that the truly free spirit would move beyond them altogether. The book is written in a strange, elevated, almost biblical style, full of images and riddles and moments of wild lyricism. Nietzsche loved this book more than anything else he wrote. He believed it was his masterpiece. He believed it contained truths that would take humanity centuries to understand, and at its centre was a single idea, an idea that Nietzsche considered the most important he had ever conceived, the idea of the Übermensch. The word is usually translated as overman or superman, though neither translation quite captures its meaning. The Übermensch is not a superhero in the modern sense. He's not a being of extraordinary physical strength or supernatural powers. He's a human being who has overcome the limitations of ordinary human existence, who has freed himself from the weight of old values, who has created new values out of himself, and who can affirm life completely, without reservation, without the need for any other world or any external justification. The Übermensch says yes to existence. He does not need God or heaven or any promise of redemption. He loves his life as it is, with all its suffering and cruelty and uncertainty, because he has made it his own. This idea has been grievously misunderstood. It was distorted by Nietzsche's sister after his collapse, used by the Nazis to justify their ideology of racial supremacy, and it has left a shadow on Nietzsche's reputation that has never fully lifted. But the Übermensch as Nietzsche conceived him had nothing to do with race, or nationalism or politics. He was a psychological and spiritual ideal, an image of what human beings might become if they could free themselves from the chains of inherited morality and think and live for themselves. He was not the strong man who crushes the weak. He was the creative man who transcends the categories of strong and weak altogether, who is so abundant in spirit that he has no need to dominate others, who creates values as naturally as a tree bears fruit. Whether such a being is possible, whether humanity is capable of this kind of transformation, was a question Nietzsche left open. He did not claim to be the Übermensch himself. He described himself as merely a herald, a forerunner, someone who could point the way but could not complete the journey. Thus spoke Zarathustra ends not with triumph, but with longing, with Zarathustra still waiting for the companions who will understand him, still uncertain whether his teaching will be heard. And there was another idea in the book, perhaps even more disturbing than the Übermensch, an idea that Nietzsche called his most abysmal thought. This was the doctrine of eternal recurrence. It came to him, he said, in August of 1881, while he was walking near a pyramidal rock beside the lake of Silvaplana in the Swiss Alps. He marked the spot in his notebook, 6,000 feet beyond man and time. It was a moment of revelation, a thought that struck him with the force of religious experience, though its content was anything but religious. Imagine, he said, that everything you have ever experienced, everything you have ever done, every joy and every sorrow, every moment of tedium and every flash of insight, every pain and every pleasure, imagine that all of it would recur exactly as it happened over and over again for all eternity. Not a better version, not a purified version, exactly as it was. The same suffering, the same failures, the same regrets, the same loves and losses, every heartbreak returning, every humiliation returning, every long afternoon when nothing seemed to matter returning again and again, world without end. How would you respond to such a thought? Would you fall to the ground in despair, cursing the demon who revealed it to you? Or would you say to that demon, "You are a god, and never have I heard anything more divine"? This was Nietzsche's test, his ultimate criterion for a life-affirming existence. Could you will the eternal return of your life? Could you love your life so completely, including its worst moments, that you would choose to live it again infinitely? If not, then you had not yet achieved what Nietzsche meant by affirmation. You were still hoping for some other life, some better world, some redemption that would make up for the failures of this one. But if you could say yes, if you could embrace the eternal recurrence, then you had achieved something like what the religious might call salvation, but without any God, without any afterlife, without anything beyond this world and this life as it actually is. It is a terrifying thought. It is meant to be terrifying. Nietzsche did not offer consolation. He offered a challenge, perhaps the greatest challenge that had ever been offered to the human spirit. Can you love your fate? Can you say yes to everything that has happened to you, not despite the suffering, but including it? Can you become so strong, so abundant, so overflowing with creative energy that you need nothing outside yourself to justify your existence? He called this amor fati, love of fate, and he considered it the highest formula of affirmation, the ultimate test of whether a person had truly overcome the nihilism that followed from the death of God. Most people, he knew, would fail this test. Most people would continue to resent their lives, to wish things had been different, to dream of another world where their suffering would be redeemed. But for those few who could pass through the fire, who could emerge on the other side still saying yes, there was something like freedom, something like joy, something like what it might mean to be fully and completely human. This was the teaching that Nietzsche developed in his lonely rooms and on his endless walks, the teaching that grew in him while his body weakened and his eyes dimmed and his headaches grew ever more unbearable. It was a teaching born from suffering, shaped by solitude, refined in the crucible of constant pain. And the world, for the most part, did not listen. His books sold poorly. His ideas were misunderstood by the few who read them. His former friends had abandoned him or died. By the middle of the 1880s, he was more alone than he had ever been, a sick man writing for an audience that did not exist, convinced that he was creating something of enormous importance, but unsure whether anyone would ever understand. And yet he continued. He continued because he had to, because the ideas would not let him rest, because the will to power that he had identified as the essence of life was still burning in him even as his body failed. The books kept coming. Beyond Good and Evil appeared in 1886, a sustained attack on traditional philosophy and its unconscious prejudices. On the Genealogy of Morals followed in 1887, the most systematic and rigorous presentation of his analysis of morality's origins. The Twilight of the Idols and the Antichrist were written in the feverish final months of 1888, along with his strange autobiography, Ex Homo, in which he reflected on his own life and works with a mixture of insight and grandiosity that seemed to hover on the edge of madness. He knew his time was running out. He could feel it. Something was changing in him, something more than the familiar headaches and stomach pains. He wrote to friends that he felt as though he was standing on the threshold of something immense, that great things were about to happen, that the world would soon know his name, and they did, but not in the way he had hoped. The catastrophe, when it came suddenly. On a cold January morning in Turin, in the first days of 1889, Friedrich Nietzsche stepped out into the streets and saw something that shattered him completely. The accounts vary in their details, as accounts from such moments always do. Some say it was in the Piazza Carlo Alberto, others place it elsewhere in the city, but the essential facts are not in dispute. There was a horse, an old cab horse, being beaten by its driver in the street. The animal was exhausted, perhaps ill, unable or unwilling to move, and the coachman was striking it with his whip, trying to force it forward. Nietzsche, walking in the winter sunlight, came upon this scene and something inside him broke. He ran to the horse. He threw his arms around its neck. He collapsed against the animal, weeping, and would not let go. The philosopher who had written so fiercely about strength and overcoming, about hardness and severity, about the need to be cruel to oneself in the pursuit of greatness, was now sobbing in the street, embracing a beaten horse, unable to rise or to explain himself. Bystanders gathered. The coachman must have been bewildered. Eventually Nietzsche was helped back to his lodgings by his landlord, who laid him on a sofa where he lay for 2 days, sometimes speaking, sometimes silent, no longer quite himself. What had happened? What had the sight of that suffering horse done to him? Some have seen in it a moment of supreme irony, the man who had declared God dead and called for the overcoming of pity now destroyed by a single act of compassion. Others have seen in it the final breaking of a mind that had been fracturing for years under the pressure of illness and isolation. Still others have wondered whether Nietzsche in that moment saw something in the horse's eyes, some reflection of his own suffering, his own years of being beaten by life, his own exhaustion at the end of a long road with no one to help him rise. We cannot know. He never told anyone what passed through his mind in that instant. The Nietzsche who might have explained it was already gone. In the days that followed, the collapse became complete. He began writing letters, strange letters, letters that mix profound insight with obvious delusion. To his friend Peter Gast, he wrote announcing the arrival of a new world order. To Cosima Wagner, Richard's widow, he wrote messages signed Dionysus. To the King of Italy, to the Vatican Secretary of State, to various acquaintances and strangers, he sent notes that range from the cryptic to the megalomaniacal. He signed some of them as the crucified. In others he proclaimed himself the successor to the dead God, the one who would complete the task of revaluing all values. The handwriting grew erratic. The ideas tumbled over one another. He was no longer writing philosophy. He was writing the fragments of a shattered mind. His friend Franz Overbeck received one of these letters and was immediately alarmed. Overbeck had known Nietzsche since their years together at Basel, had watched his friend's declining health with growing worry, had tried to help where he could. Now he recognised that something catastrophic had happened. He travelled immediately to Turin and found Nietzsche in a state that horrified him. The philosopher was alternately docile and agitated, sometimes lucid and sometimes lost in fantasies of grandeur. He spoke of himself in the third person, as though Friedrich Nietzsche were someone else, someone he was observing from a great distance. He sang and played the piano, sometimes with flashes of his old brilliance, sometimes in ways that made no musical sense. When Overbeck asked him questions, his answers wandered into regions that had no connection to reality. Overbeck arranged for his friend to be transported back to Germany. The journey was difficult. Nietzsche's condition fluctuated between calm and crisis. He arrived in Basel, where he was briefly examined by doctors, and then he was taken to a psychiatric clinic in Jena. The diagnosis was swift and, for that era, essentially final. He was suffering from progressive paralysis, a condition typically attributed to the tertiary stage of syphilis. His brain was being slowly destroyed. There was no cure and no hope of recovery. The Nietzsche who had written Thus Spoke Zarathustra, who had scaled the heights of philosophical imagination, would spend his remaining years in a twilight from which there would be no return. The question of what caused his collapse has never been definitively answered, and it probably never will be. The syphilis diagnosis was the standard explanation for many years, based on the pattern of his symptoms and the prevalence of the disease in that era. According to this theory, Nietzsche had contracted the infection in his youth, perhaps during his student days, perhaps during his brief service as a medical orderly in the Franco-Prussian War. The disease had then remained dormant for decades, slowly destroying his nervous system, finally erupting into the madness of his final years. It would explain the headaches, the vision problems, the stomach troubles, the grandiosity, and the ultimate collapse. It fits the medical understanding of the time, but other explanations have been proposed. Some scholars have pointed to the family history, to the death of his father from what was called softening of the brain at a similar age. Perhaps there was a hereditary component, a weakness in the family line, a tendency toward this kind of neural catastrophe. Some have suggested a slow-growing brain tumour that gradually pressed upon his faculties until they could no longer function. Others have proposed strokes, perhaps a series of small ones that accumulated over the years. The truth is that 19th century medicine lacked the tools to diagnose such conditions precisely, and 20th century scholars have been left to speculate based on incomplete evidence. What is certain is that something organic had gone wrong, that his brain had been damaged in ways that made recovery impossible, and that the brilliant, difficult, suffering man who had written those books would never write another word. After Jena, Nietzsche was moved to the care of his mother in Naumburg. She was in her 70s now, the same woman who had raised him in that household of women after his father's death, the same pious Lutheran who had watched with incomprehension as her brilliant son attacked Christianity and declared God dead. Now she tended to him as one tends to a child, or to a very old man. He was docile most of the time, quiet, capable of recognising familiar faces and responding to simple requests. Sometimes he spoke in sentences that made sense. Sometimes he played the piano for hours, lost in the music, his fingers finding patterns that his conscious mind could no longer direct. Sometimes he sat in silence, staring at nothing, and no one could tell what, if anything, was happening behind his eyes. His mother died in 1897, and the care of Friedrich passed to his sister Elizabeth. This would prove to be a fateful transfer, for Elizabeth Förster Nietzsche was a woman with ambitions of her own, and a willingness to use her famous brother to achieve them. She had married a man named Bernhard Förster, a prominent anti-Semite and German nationalist who had attempted to establish a pure Aryan colony in the jungles of Paraguay. The colony had failed, and Förster had taken his own life. Elizabeth had returned to Germany a widow, carrying with her all her husband's ideological commitments and adding them to her own. She took control of Nietzsche's papers. She established the Nietzsche Archive. She began the long process of editing, curating and publishing his remaining works, including the vast collection of unpublished notes that he had left behind. And she did so with an agenda. Elizabeth was determined to present her brother as a prophet of German nationalism, a forerunner of the movements that would reshape German politics in the decades to come. She emphasized passages that could be read as supporting German superiority. She downplayed or suppressed his explicit attacks on anti-Semitism and nationalism. She arranged his notes into a book she called The Will to Power and presented it as his masterwork, the culmination of his philosophical project, even though Nietzsche himself had abandoned plans for a book by that title, and the compilation was largely her own editorial creation. The irony is bitter and profound. Nietzsche had written repeatedly against anti-Semitism, calling it a sign of weakness and resentment, a failure to transcend the herd mentality he despised. He had mocked German nationalism, dismissed the idea of racial purity as scientific nonsense, and predicted with uncanny accuracy the kinds of disasters that would follow when nations convinced themselves of their own exceptional destiny. He had broken his friendship with Wagner in part because of Wagner's anti-Semitism. He had written that he wanted to see Germans intermarry with Jews, whom he considered among the most vital people in Europe. He had little patience for the chest-thumping patriotism that was rising around him in the final years of the German Empire. But none of this mattered to Elizabeth. She had a story to tell about her brother, and she told it, and the world listened because Nietzsche could no longer speak for himself. She invited important visitors to the archive, allowed them to gaze upon the silent philosopher in his invalid's chair, cultivated relationships with the German cultural establishment. When Adolf Hitler came to power decades later, she met him personally, presented him with her brother's walking stick, posed for photographs with the Führer at the archive. The image of that meeting haunts the reception of Nietzsche's work to this day. The silent philosopher weaponized by a sister he had once criticized for her husband's foolish anti-Semitism, his ideas twisted into service of a movement that would have horrified him. Meanwhile, Nietzsche himself lived on, if it could be called living. Visitors who saw him in those final years described a figure almost unrecognizable from the intense, combative intellectual he had once been. He had grown heavy and slow, his famous moustache grown wild, his eyes often vacant. Sometimes he seemed to recognize visitors, sometimes not. Sometimes he spoke a few words, sometimes he simply sat. The philosophical fire was gone, extinguished, leaving only the shell of a man whose mind had burned too brightly and too long. He died on August 25th, 1900, in Weimar, where the archive had been moved. The cause was listed as a stroke. He was 55 years old. His body was taken back to Röcken, to the village where he had been born, and buried in the churchyard beside the graves of his father and his younger brother. The country pastor's son had come home at last, but death was not the end of his influence. It was in many ways only the beginning. The books he had written in his decade of solitude, the books that had sold so poorly during his lifetime, began to find readers. At first they found readers for the wrong reasons, drawn to the distorted version of his thought that Elizabeth promoted, the nationalist interpretation that would prove so dangerous in the coming century. But gradually other readers came, readers who approached the text directly, who read what Nietzsche had actually written rather than what his sister claimed he meant. What they found there was complicated and challenging, and often deliberately provocative. They found a thinker who refused easy answers, who seemed to delight in shocking his readers out of their comfortable assumptions, who used aphorism and metaphor and irony in ways that made interpretation difficult. They found passages that could be quoted to support almost any position, which is precisely how his work came to be misused so badly. A writer who says yes and no in the same paragraph, who changes perspectives constantly, who employs masks and personae, is easy to misread and easy to appropriate for purposes he never intended. But they also found something genuine beneath the provocation. They found a sustained and serious investigation of the most fundamental questions, questions about meaning and value and the human capacity to create both. They found a psychologist of extraordinary insight, someone who could probe the hidden motivations behind moral judgments, who could expose the resentment hiding beneath humility, the will to power concealed within apparent selflessness. They found a philosopher who took the death of God seriously as a cultural fact, and then tried to think through what it meant for human beings to live without transcendent foundations, without cosmic purposes, without the comfort of knowing that their suffering served some higher plan. This is why Nietzsche became so important to the 20th century, even beyond the misappropriations. When Sigmund Freud developed psychoanalysis, he was building on insights that Nietzsche had arrived at first, the idea that consciousness is only the surface of the mind, that our true motivations are hidden even from ourselves, that we rationalize and deceive ourselves constantly. Freud admitted as much, claiming that he had deliberately avoided reading Nietzsche closely because the philosopher had anticipated too much of what he wanted to discover independently. The acknowledgement was both tribute and anxiety, the recognition that this strange, sick wanderer had seen further into the human psyche than almost anyone before him. When the existentialists emerged in the mid-20th century, when Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus and Martin Heidegger grappled with questions of meaning in a meaningless universe, they were continuing a conversation that Nietzsche had begun. His insistence that existence precedes essence, that there are no pre-given purposes written into the structure of things, that human beings must create their own values rather than discovering them, these ideas became the foundation of existentialist thought. Even thinkers who disagreed with him fundamentally, who rejected his conclusions or recoiled from his rhetoric, had to grapple with the questions he had raised. He had changed the terms of the conversation, and for theologians, surprisingly, Nietzsche proved to be an unexpected gift. His attack on Christianity was so fierce, so uncompromising, so willing to expose the weaknesses and resentments that he believed underlay Christian morality, that it forced believers to confront their faith in new ways. Some found their faith strengthened by the confrontation, refined in the fire of his critique. Others found in Nietzsche's vision of a godless universe the challenge they needed to think more deeply about what they actually believed and why. The death of God that he announced was, for some theologians, not the end of religion but the beginning of a more honest and demanding religious practice, one that did not rely on easy consolations or unexamined traditions. By the second half of the 20th century, Nietzsche's reputation had largely been rescued from the nationalist appropriation. Scholars had examined Elizabeth's editorial practices and exposed the extent of her distortions. New editions of his works appeared, based on careful study of the original manuscripts. The Nietzsche who emerged from this scholarly recovery was not the proto-Nazi that propaganda had created, but a far more complex and troubling figure, a philosopher who defied easy political categorization, who attacked all forms of mass politics and herd thinking, who valued individual creativity and spiritual achievement above national or racial identity. This Nietzsche is the one we inherit today, though even now the misunderstandings persist. His name is invoked by people who have never read him carefully, attached to positions he would have found ridiculous. The Übermensch becomes a cartoon superhero, or a justification for egotism, when Nietzsche himself saw it as an ideal of creative self-overcoming, available only to the rarest spirits. The will to power becomes a crude assertion of dominance, when Nietzsche understood it as something far more subtle, the fundamental life force that expresses itself in all forms of growth and creation. Even among scholars the debates continue, for Nietzsche wrote in ways that invite ongoing interpretation and resist final conclusions. What remains beyond dispute is the magnitude of his influence. No serious engagement with modern thought can avoid him. He is one of those thinkers, like Plato or Aristotle or Kant, who divided intellectual history into before and after. Whatever one thinks of his conclusions, his questions cannot be ignored. The death of God, the will to power, the eternal recurrence, the critique of morality, the challenge of affirmation, these are not merely historical curiosities but live problems that we continue to wrestle with in philosophy, in psychology, in art, in the endless human effort to understand ourselves and make meaning in a universe that offers no guarantees. And through it all, there remains the man himself, the suffering man, the lonely man, the man who wrote in pain and isolation, who knew that he was dying slowly, who poured everything he had into books that almost no one read, who kept writing anyway because he could not stop, because the ideas demanded to be born, because the will to create was stronger than the decay of the body. He is not a comfortable figure to contemplate. He does not offer reassurance. He did not intend to. He offered instead a challenge, perhaps the hardest challenge any philosopher has ever posed, the challenge to look without flinching at the world as it really is, without the consolations of religion, without the comforts of traditional morality, and still to say yes, to affirm, to love one's fate, to become who one is. That was his teaching, born from suffering, refined in solitude, offered to a future that might or might not be ready to receive it. In the quiet of his room, in the mountains above the valleys, in the coastal towns where he walked alone, he had stared into the abyss and he had not looked away. and the abyss, as he warned us, had gazed back into him. What it saw there, what it made of him, we can only guess. But perhaps we can do more than guess. Perhaps, if we follow him carefully through those final years, through the long silence that descended after Turin, we can catch glimpses of what remained when the words finally stopped. After Franz Overbeck brought Nietzsche back from Italy in January of 1889, the philosopher spent a brief period in a psychiatric clinic in Basel, where the doctors observed him with a mixture of clinical detachment and something like bewilderment. Here was one of the most celebrated minds in German philosophy, reduced to childlike confusion, alternating between periods of calm lucidity and episodes of grandiose delusion. He would speak of himself as a god, as the ruler of the world, as the orchestrator of great events, and then he would fall silent for hours, sitting by the window and watching the sky with an expression that no one could read. The doctors recorded their observations in careful medical prose, but the prose could not capture what was actually happening in that room, the slow dimming of a light that had once burned so fiercely it had threatened to consume everything around it. His mother, Franziska, came to claim him after a few weeks. She was an elderly woman by then, worn down by years of worry over her brilliant and difficult son, but she took him back to Naumburg, to the town where he had spent his childhood, and she cared for him in her own home with a devotion that never wavered. She did not pretend to understand his philosophy. She had never pretended to understand it. She was a simple Lutheran woman who had prayed for her son's soul and grieved over his rejection of the faith she had raised him in. But she loved him, in that uncomprehending and unconditional way that mothers sometimes love children who have grown too strange for them to follow. She fed him and bathed him, and sat with him through the long afternoons when he said nothing at all, and she was beside him when he played the piano, those remnants of musical genius that would surface unpredictably, fragments of old melodies, and sometimes entirely new compositions that he seemed to create spontaneously, his fingers finding patterns on the keys that no one had taught him. The music had always been there, from the beginning. It was among the last things to leave. The visitors who came to see him in those years left behind accounts that are difficult to read. Some came out of genuine concern, old friends who remembered the brilliant young professor, the electrifying conversationalist, the man whose letters had crackled with insight and provocation. They found instead a gentle, vacant presence, someone who smiled at them without recognition, who sometimes uttered phrases that seemed to echo his old writings but without coherence, scattered words like will and eternal and creation floating up from whatever remained of his interior life. Others came out of curiosity, intellectuals and admirers who wanted to see the famous philosopher in his decline, who sat in Franziska's parlour and observed him as though he were an exhibit, a cautionary tale, a monument to the dangers of thinking too deeply about dangerous things. One can only imagine what Nietzsche himself would have made of this, if any part of him could still have made anything of it. He who had valued solitude above almost everything else, who had written that loneliness was not a curse but a distinction, now had no solitude left. He was surrounded by people who watched him with eyes full of meanings he could not read. Franziska died in 1897, when Nietzsche had been in this twilight state for 8 years. He was transferred to the care of his sister Elizabeth, who had returned from Paraguay after the failure of her husband's colonial venture and her husband's subsequent suicide. Elizabeth took him to Weimar, the city of Goethe and Schiller, the cultural capital of classical German civilization, and she installed him in a grand house that she called the Nietzsche Archive. Here she began the work that would shape his legacy for decades, editing his papers, controlling access to his manuscripts, receiving the growing stream of visitors who came to pay homage to the philosopher whose fame was finally beginning to grow. And she used her brother as a prop in this enterprise, displaying him to selected guests as though he were a holy relic, the living but unseeing witness to his own posthumous glory. There are photographs from this period that survive. In them Nietzsche sits in a chair by a window or on a garden bench, dressed in a white robe, his great moustache still full, his eyes open but looking at nothing. Some of the photographs were staged by Elizabeth for publicity purposes, arranged to make him look like a sage in contemplation rather than a man whose mind had been largely erased. They are unsettling images. They show the body that had carried that extraordinary consciousness, the hands that had written the words that would reshape modern thought, but the consciousness itself is gone, or so deeply buried that no one could reach it. We look at those photographs and we see a shell and we wonder what, if anything, still moved within it. The reports of his final years are scattered and contradictory. Some observers claimed that he showed occasional flickers of awareness, that he would respond to music or to the mention of certain names, that his eyes would briefly focus before drifting away again. Others saw only blankness, the steady mechanical functioning of a body whose pilot had long since departed. He was no longer able to read or write. He was no longer able to hold a conversation. He was no longer able, in any meaningful sense, to be Friedrich Nietzsche. And yet, the body persisted, breathing and eating and sleeping year after year, as though it had forgotten how to stop. He died on August 25th, 1900, at the age of 55. The immediate cause was a stroke, following a series of smaller strokes that had gradually weakened him over the preceding months. Elizabeth was there, of course, already composing in her mind the narrative she would tell the world, already planning the elaborate funeral that would befit a great German thinker. He was buried in Röcken, in the village where he had been born, in the churchyard beside his father and his infant brother. The grave was marked with a simple stone. Around it, the church where his father had preached still stood, and the parsonage where he had spent his earliest years, and the fields and forests of the Saxon countryside that he had wandered as a child, before he knew what he would become, before he had seen anything that would need to be affirmed or denied. And that might be the end of the story, if stories ever truly ended. But the strange fate of Friedrich Nietzsche was that his most consequential existence began only after his death. The books that had sold barely a few hundred copies during his lifetime began to circulate more widely. Readers who had ignored him discovered him. Philosophers who had dismissed him returned to his pages with fresh eyes. By the early 20th century he had become unavoidable. His influence spread through European culture like a slow fire, touching everything it reached. In philosophy proper, his impact was immense. The existentialists of the 20th century, from Heidegger to Sartre to Camus, found in Nietzsche a predecessor who had already asked their most urgent questions. What does it mean to exist in a world without inherent meaning? How does one create values rather than merely receiving them? What does authentic existence look like when all the traditional supports have been removed? These were Nietzschean questions before they were existentialist questions, and the answers that later thinkers proposed were always in dialogue with what he had written, whether they acknowledged it or not. Heidegger dedicated years of lectures to Nietzsche's texts, finding in them both profound insights and fundamental errors, wrestling with them as one wrestles only with a thinker who cannot be dismissed. Sartre's concept of radical freedom, and the anguish it brings, echoes Nietzsche's vision of the individual who must create meaning in a meaningless universe. Camus, in his meditation on the myth of Sisyphus, arrived at an affirmation of life in the face of absurdity that recalls nothing so much as Nietzsche's amor fati, though Camus gave it his own distinct expression. The conversation continues still, in every philosophy seminar where Nietzsche's texts are read, in every book that takes up the problems he posed, but his influence extended far beyond academic philosophy. In psychology, Freud acknowledged Nietzsche as a precursor who had anticipated many of his own insights about the unconscious, about the role of drives and instincts, about the complex dynamics of human motivation. Freud claimed that he deliberately avoided reading Nietzsche's works too closely, precisely because he found them too resonant with his own thinking, as though he feared being accused of mere repetition. Whether this claim was entirely honest, who can say, but the structural parallels between their ideas are undeniable. Nietzsche's concept of the will to power, properly understood, anticipates Freud's libido. His analysis of resentment, the psychological poison of repressed envy and hatred, anticipates Freud's theories of repression and neurosis. His insistence that consciousness is only a small part of mental life, that vast forces operate beneath the surface of awareness, is a direct anticipation of the psychoanalytic vision of the mind. Jung, too, found in Nietzsche a profound influence, seeing in the Dionysian and Apollonian principles a prefiguration of his own theories about archetypes and the collective unconscious. The entire modern tradition of depth psychology, of looking beneath the surface of human behaviour to find the hidden forces that drive it, owes a debt to Nietzsche that can never be fully repaid. And then there was literature. The writers of the early 20th century read Nietzsche voraciously. Thomas Mann, whose novels explored with such subtlety the tensions between art and life, between bourgeois respectability and creative destruction, was steeped in Nietzsche from his earliest years. Rainer Maria Rilke found in Nietzsche's vision of creative self-overcoming a model for his own poetic project. Hermann Hesse's novels are almost unthinkable without Nietzsche's influence, particularly that quest for spiritual authenticity beyond conventional morality that drives so much of his fiction. Across Europe, and eventually across the world, writers encountered Nietzsche's prose and found themselves changed by it, not merely by the ideas but by the style. That fusion of aphorism and essay, that combination of philosophical rigour and poetic intensity, that willingness to write beautifully about the most disturbing subjects. He had expanded what philosophy could sound like, and the expansion was permanent. Even in theology, where one might expect him to be regarded only as an enemy, his influence proved fertile. The death of God, that phrase he had placed in the mouth of a madman, became for some religious thinkers not a conclusion but a starting point. If the old God was dead, the God of metaphysical certainty and easy comfort, then perhaps a new and more authentic faith could emerge, one that took seriously the terror of existence and the responsibility of belief. Theologians like Paul Tillich engaged deeply with Nietzsche's critique, finding in it not a refutation of religion but a purification of it, a burning away of the dross that had accumulated over centuries of complacent faith. Even Karl Barth, that most orthodox of modern Protestant theologians, acknowledged Nietzsche's challenge and sought to answer it on its own terms. The 20th century's theological renaissance, its rediscovery of the strangeness and difficulty of genuine religious commitment, owed something to the hammer blows that Nietzsche had struck against the temples of his age, and so the quiet pastor's son from a small village in Saxony became one of the architects of modern consciousness. The child who had been called the little pastor by his schoolmates, so devout was his early faith, had grown into the man who proclaimed the death of God and foresaw the catastrophic century that would follow. The brilliant young professor who had seemed destined for a conventional academic career had abandoned that career to become a wanderer, a solitary voice in the wilderness, writing for readers who did not yet exist. The suffering man who had battled migraines and stomach troubles and the slow failure of his eyesight had nonetheless produced a body of work so powerful that it outlived his body by far, reaching into the minds of strangers across oceans and generations, sparking fires he could not have predicted, illuminating corners of human experience he could not have imagined. What are we to make of such a life? Perhaps the only honest answer is that we cannot make anything final of it, that Nietzsche remains a problem rather than a solution, a question rather than an answer. He would have wanted it that way. He despised disciples who merely repeated what the master said. He valued readers who would fight him, who would take what they needed from his work and forge it into something new, something he himself could never have created. He was not interested in being followed. He was interested in provoking thought, in disturbing complacency, in shattering the idols that human beings erect to avoid the terrifying freedom of genuine existence. If we read him rightly, we do not become Nietzscheans. We become more fully ourselves. And yet there is something in his story that goes beyond philosophy, something that touches us in a more intimate place. The loneliness of it, the suffering, the years of walking through mountain passes in pain, writing sentences that burned with intensity while his body slowly failed. The courage it took to keep going, to keep saying yes to life even when life was saying no to him in every possible way. The vision of the eternal recurrence, that terrible test he had devised, and his own apparent willingness to pass it, to affirm that he would live his painful existence again and again for eternity, rather than wish it had never been. There is something magnificent in that, and something heartbreaking, and perhaps something a little mad. But then, he never claimed that sanity was the highest value. He claimed that greatness was, and greatness often looks like madness to those who lack the eyes to see. In the end, we are left with the image of a man alone in the mountains, a man whose thoughts raced faster than his pen could follow, a man who knew that he was dying, who knew that his time was short and who used every hour of it to say what he had to say. The alpine light falling across the page, the sound of his own footsteps on the rocky paths, the long evenings in bare rooms with nothing but his manuscripts and his pain, and through it all the certainty, the absolute unshakable certainty, that what he was doing mattered, that someone would one day understand, that the future would vindicate what the present could not receive. The future did vindicate him, though not in ways he could have foreseen, and not without distortions he would have found agonizing. But that is the fate of all great thinkers. They plant seeds they cannot tend, and the gardens that grow are never quite what they imagined. Nietzsche planted his seeds in solitude, watered them with suffering, and died before he could see what they became. We walk among those gardens now, whether we know it or not. The questions he asked are our questions. The abyss he stared into is our abyss. The challenge he issued, to affirm life in all its terror and beauty, without illusions, without consolations, without the easy comforts that most of us cling to. That challenge remains as urgent today as it was in the mountains above Sils Maria 140 years ago. And in a quiet churchyard in Rücken, beside the church where his father once preached, beneath the trees that have grown and changed through the centuries since his death, the body of Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche lies still. The brilliant eyes are closed, the restless mind is silent, the suffering is over. What remains is the work, and the work remains forever, waiting for the next reader to pick it up, to wrestle with it, to be changed by it, to carry it forward into whatever future we are making. The abyss gazes still, and somewhere perhaps, in the eternal return of all things, the same small child is being born again in the same small village, bearing the same name, destined for the same extraordinary and terrible journey. The story does not end. It cannot end. He made sure of that.